This project will allow us to explore the transformative and expressive power of color. To do this, I will start from this very simple countryside landscape and change the entire composition to create an almost unreal imaginary sunset. I will intentionally avoid realism and look for completely new colors. We will call this the normal landscape and this one the transformed landscape. I'm going to change everything. This means that the gamut will have to be modified completely, starting with the pigments. All this demonstration will guide you through the different steps of my chromatic composition. I do not claim that this is the best way to proceed. The ideal way to proceed is to have reference colors that are close to those you want to paint. However, when the colors of reality are too limited, theory can offer new perspectives to the imagination. This study will not seek to conform to the model, but will use theoretical knowledge to transform the chromatic universe of a composition. As this is a landscape with transformed colors, I start by carrying out multiple color studies. I mix pigments according to my inspiration. I first consider a rather classic combination of red, orange and yellow, but by making a small miniature directly on the palette, I find that this arrangement is somewhat excessive. In my head, these colors are too immediately associated with fire, and that's not what I'm looking for. I then turn to much cooler and darker night colors, ranging from a deep blue to a somewhat dark, deep cyan. However, here it's the opposite. I find that these colors are too cool and they carry too much of a sort of moonlight look, and I want to create more some impression of twilight and not night. I'm looking for an impression that's both calm and dramatic, so I finally choose a warm, cool opposition with blue cyan and rose, red, orange. You'll surely ask me, why didn't you take a picture of this landscape at sunset directly? This would be much easier. Well, first let's just say that it wouldn't have been fun to do it like this, and above all, there is no way a camera could get natural colors like the one I have in my mind for this project. The eye, combined with the infinite power of imagination, is far superior to what the best camera can capture. If you look at this shot recorded with a camera, you can see that to have enough sensitivity to capture the colors of the sky, the trees and landscape have to appear black. But when I was there to capture this footage, I could clearly see both the landscape and the colors of the sky at the same time. So there are some things that the eye can see and the camera is incapable of seeing. So what I did was I fed my imagination with the memories of this site, and now I can integrate these colors into my palette. I want to start with the idea of a sunset with pink and blue tones. The idea is to avoid making this sunset too orange, so rather than using red pigments like pyrrole or cadmium, I'll use quinacridone rose. This pigment will allow me to create both vermilion shades by adding yellow, but it will also allow me to draw the colors towards magenta and offer a rich range of roses and possibly violets. The chromatic map I established for this project is the following: a dominant declined in several subdominants, ranging from warm brown to magenta red and light pink, and a blue cyan tonic to create the focus point of the painting. The accent I have in mind will be a very light yellow-orange, not very chromatic, which will allow me to represent the location of the setting sun behind the horizon, and which will allow me to break the monotony of the two shades. Since the model does not have the same colors as the composition I have in mind, I need to transpose the colors to conform them to my idea. Remember, there are two methods: play on the accessories or transform the gamut by exchanging the pigments, playing the role of the primary colors. In this case, it's not really possible to play on the accessories, so I'm going to proceed by changing the primary colors and the gamut. I start by determining which primary pigments I would need if I wanted to paint the colors normally. As this landscape is mainly green and blue, possible pigments would be, let's say, titanium white, yellow ochre, raw umber, chromium oxide green, cerulean blue, and ultramarine blue deep. We can say that these pigments are the mixing primaries for the normal landscape. I first mix 5 samples that represent a set of average colors. We see that the yellow-green hues dominate, which is normal because the trees and the pond represent a large part of the landscape. I keep these colors as a reference for later on a small piece of canvas. Now let's see which primaries I can keep and which ones I can exchange for my new composition. Since I want to create an impression of twilight, I know that the luminosity will no longer allow me to distinguish green very well. I know that the strong chromatic greens will no longer be visible because that's what happens when the sky becomes yellow, orange, or magenta. The effect is that blue and green become dull because they are complementary to these colors. This means that I can remove the green and replace it with an opposite color, and I choose quinacridone rose. If I ever need a green, a mixture of blue and yellow or cyan and yellow will be fine. And rather than using raw umber, which has a slightly yellow-green undertone, I choose burnt umber, which offers warmer, more orange undertones. I replace the cerulean blue with phthalo turquoise, which will allow me to create more powerful cyan and create an almost surreal effect. Remember, this is my tonic, so it has to convey more energy than the rest. So I want a very strong pigment. Finally, white, yellow, and ultramarine blue do not change, so I can keep them for my new composition. Now, I can put aside the pigments of the normal landscape because I won't use them. The challenge here is to use the new pigments to replace them. Thus, it will be necessary to resist the desire to use green and instead find a color that can play the same role without breaking the harmony of the transformed colors. All the colors of the transformed landscape must be included in the gamut formed by titanium white, yellow ochre, burnt umber, quinacridone rose, phthalo turquoise, and ultramarine blue, and that's it, no other color. Once again, I mix a set of average colors to see the difference between the original and the transformed colors. By placing them in front of the old ones, we can really see the difference. I put them on the piece of canvas I used earlier and take note of the pigments and mixtures I used. Before I start, I do a color study on a small piece of painting paper. I mix the pigments spontaneously to get a very rough idea of my project. The purpose of this step is to make sure that the colors I chose actually match with my initial idea, This is also an opportunity to try them out and, if necessary, undo everything before it's too late. Of course, you can also do this in your head. I do many samples and studies to make the process easier to follow. But in reality, it's not that complicated. Everything is decided once you deliberately put some pigments aside and make the decision to use only the new pigments in the palette and no other. And it's very important, no other pigment. The colors that you will create will naturally harmonize, whether you're aware of it or not. If you don't use any additional pigments, all your mixtures will be compressed into a specific gamut, and you will only have to work on their relationships to each other within this restricted gamut. It's like if your printer was missing an ink cartridge and you still programmed it to print anyway. All the colors would be shifted, but relatively to each other, they would still maintain the same relations. For example, in the case of my project, there is no green or very little green. However, some mixtures are greener than others. These are the colors that will play the role of green, but we'll come back to that later. Now, that's it. My study is finished. It's the guide that I'll be using for this project. Since I modified the colors entirely, there is no problem using the computer screen as a model. On the screen, I display the original image, and I'll use it for the drawing. If you know how to use digital painting softwares, you can also modify your original photo to get a better idea of the desired result. I start the painting with a wash of burnt umber, quinacridone rose, and yellow. This color is in a way an average color that matches the dominant of my painting. I use it to blocking the main shapes and to set the first indications of the values. I dilute generously with odorless mineral spirits, and with a cloth, wipe out to preserve some of the white of the surface. I start drawing with the same paint, less diluted, and with a couple of flat brushes and a round brush. Once the basic shapes of the drawing have been laid, I can prepare my palette. Before I start painting with the full range of colors, I want to make sure that my palette is well organized. To respect my composition, I separate my mixtures into 4 main families: yellow, pink-red, brown-green, and blue cyan. For clarity, I place them on my palette in the same order as on the canvas. Each family of color is divided in various shades of value or hue. These are somewhat basic gradations that will serve as a mixing base during the painting. It's always easier to have some average mixtures ready than to mix everything from scratch all the time. So if I need to make a mixture more blue, darker, lighter, I can still do that, but I will start with one of those prepared mixtures. I'm now starting to apply the first colors. The order in which I proceed is simply a matter of method. I follow the distance of the planes to cover the most distant element first, and then I cover them with the objects in the foreground. That's why I start with the sky and the reflections, then I'll move on to the trees that cover the sky area. And finally, I'll take care of the foreground. So I go from the most distant objects to the closest, which is why I start with the sky. To what does the sky owe its color? The blue sky is due to a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering. To put it simply, the shorter and more energetic the wavelength, the easier it is to diffuse it into the atmosphere. Thus, blue with a wavelength of 400 nanometers will be much more diffused than red with a wavelength of 800 nanometers. But is the sky really blue? If you look at the zenith on a beautiful afternoon, you will see a blue cyan. The closer you get to the horizon, the more light has to go through a thick layer of air, and the paler the color becomes. There is therefore a significant gradient of value that shows that white paint is as important as blue paint to paint the sky. In terms of pigments, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, Prussian blue are the closest to the basic hue of the sky, but they always must be mixed so as not to appear too chromatic and too strong. The blue sky is not that blue. That's why white is essential. You can even add a little touch of ivory black to make it less blue. Ultramarine blue is somewhat too purple to be usable as it is. From an artist's point of view, we realize that the sky is filled with extremely varied shades depending on the angle or even the time of the day. At sunrise or sunset, the sky shows its most beautiful colors. In the evening or morning, sunlight has to pass through a thicker atmospheric layer, and this thick layer of air filters almost all wavelength except orange and red, which gives this characteristic hue. The nuance you can see in a rising sun or setting sun are infinite. A sight like this is felt more than seen. So don't hesitate to let your sensitivity run wild. The classic colors of a sunrise or sunset are distributed as follows: white, yellow, orange, red, where the red of the outer halo meets the bluish shades of the twilight sky. A purple-magenta mixture is sometimes formed. This subtle color is generally only visible in clouds or on mountains very far in the distance. We have a wide variety of shades from yellow to deep blue, and the only family of hues that does not express itself is the green family. Green in a sunset or a sunrise becomes a dark yellow-orange or some type of brown. Foliage and vegetation always seem more or less green to us in this context because our brain knows what it is. However, at sunset, the hue of the vegetation is entirely shifted towards orange. Now let's talk about clouds. During the day, they have all kinds of shades, mainly white, gray, or bluish. The amount of blue depends on the thickness of the clouds and also how much blue sky there is all around. The shapes and colors of the clouds are very varied, but they are quite easy to paint spontaneously with wide brushes, and you can let the colors merge without fear of losing realism. Observed in the direction of the sun, the clouds can also take a white-yellow hue, as can be seen in this remarkable contre-jour landscape by Andres Achenbach. Let's go back to our painting. Here the colors are more imaginary than real. However, I try to follow the natural colors of a sunset by drawing inspiration from different images. The closer you get to the sun, the more you get to yellow-white, then the sky turns orange, pink and blue on the other side. Clouds create various sets of values. I try to paint them with very wide brushes to keep a very vaporous character and avoid giving them too much strength. I start with a very dynamic sky, alternating the colors in layers, and following a diagonal that breaks the rigid stability of the landscape. I try to create a peaceful but yet dramatic mood to suggest that something may be coming, but that you can still appreciate the quiet harmony of these colors. You can see that I paint the reflections of the pond as I paint the sky. I use these shades for reflections. Every time I paint an area of the sky, I paint its reflection in the water. As the water in this pond is naturally greenish or brown, this tint affects the color of the reflections. Is the water really blue? The answer is yes, among other things. It's also colorless, cyan, green, gray, yellow, brown, depending on the context. Water filters most wavelength except blue. Close to the surface, the water is colorless and transparent because it allows all the white light to pass through. The red wavelengths disappear first at about a depth of 5 meters, which first gives water a cyan hue. At about 10 meters, orange is also absorbed, so the color of the water gradually becomes cyan blue. At about 20 meters, yellow is absorbed as well, so the water turns into a deeper blue. At about 30 meters, the green disappears and there's only a deep purple blue left, quite close to the limit of the visible spectrum. Finally, this blue ends up being absorbed at a depth of about 100 meters, which makes everything pitch black. But water is almost never pure, and this phenomenon is not seen very often, because in reality water contains a lot of particles in suspension, and these particles can change its hue. The mud and dirt give a brown or yellow hue, iron oxide can make it red, and the presence of phytoplankton gives it a green appearance, as is the case here. This is where things become complicated. Water has its own color, but it also owes its color to its context, i.e. to the phenomena of reflection and refraction. Refraction determines what's visible from below the surface, whereas reflection determines what's visible from above the surface. Let's see how these two notions affect the color of a body of water in a landscape. First, let's talk about reflection. The visibility of reflections on the water depends on the agitation of the surface. When the surface is agitated with a lot of small ripples, it diffuses light to give a medium color, which is an average of the hue of the water and the hue of the surrounding colors. When the surface is very quiet and smooth, the contours of the reflections are clearly distinguishable, almost like a mirror. Refraction depends more on the angle of observation. Objects below the surface are less visible if light must pass through a large volume of water before reaching the eye. This means that the more you observe a body of water from an acute angle, the less visible what's below the surface is. To clearly distinguish stones or whatever is on the bottom of the pond, you have to look from above at a right angle. Let's look at one last thing with this example. The more direct light the water receives, the more the phenomenon of refraction dominates and imposes its color on the reflections. The more shadow there is, the less water is hit by direct sunlight, and the less dominant the hue of the water is, and therefore the more visible the reflections are. Most of the time, when we look at the landscape, we have our eyes towards the horizon, which means that the refractions are almost indistinct, so it's the reflections that appear most clearly. Does that mean that refractions don't matter? Not at all, because even if the objects below the surface are not visible, the color of the water affects the color of the reflections. Refractions makes the reflections darker because some of the light is absorbed and passes below the surface. Reflections are actually an optical mixtures of refraction and reflection. And to follow this phenomenon, here is a simple technique. The reflections must be painted with a mixture of the color of the objects reflected and the hue of the water itself. I have to use the color of the sky, to which I add the slightly brown color of the water. And this makes the reflection of the sky darker and gives it a small part of the hue of the water. Since the reflection is a mixture of the original and the color of the water, the darker colors might appear lighter in their reflection. Look carefully on the model. The reflection here is darker, while the reflection of the tree is lighter. You have to be very careful because you cannot always say that water makes colors lighter or darker. It all depends on how important is the phenomenon of refraction. So for each nuance of the sky, I create a slightly brown or greenish version using just a small touch of burnt umber or yellow ochre. As we've already explained, some of the light that reaches the surface of the water is absorbed, so the reflections must be slightly darker. Once again, the burnt umber works ideally for this, and all you have to do is add a little touch. Finally, with regard to water, there is an interesting phenomenon related to the agitation of the surface of this landscape. This whole area is agitated, perhaps by wind or currents, so the reflections are scattered in all directions. The reflection is not an entirely flat mirror, but an average color, as if a representative sample of all the colors of the area had been taken. To paint the sky and the clouds here, I continue with a large soft brush. This kind of marshmallow effect is very fun to paint, and I don't really have to worry about technique because it's very simple to paint. I want to create something vaporous so that the clouds don't really appear separately and are all merged into one big unit. I try to create a big dome of clouds that blend into each other as if they were pushed by a strong wind. For the reflections of the sky in the water, I try to blend the colors even more. In the reflections, the clouds blend into each other, but they also blend with the muddy color of the water. I want to recreate this impression on my panel. That's why I use large brushes and try to keep an ample and swift gesture. Now I will start painting the trees and grass. And this particular range of colors that will allow me to create the dark atmosphere of the twilight. We will see that in this case, the green will have a very particular specificity. But first, let's see some important points about the color of vegetation. Foliage gets its color from chlorophyll. But behind this green pigment, there are many nuances. First of all, when we talk about chlorophyll, which green is it exactly? It depends on the light. When the leaf is lit by direct sunlight, it has a strong yellow-green hue, much closer to yellow than green in fact. In the shadow, the leaf takes a medium green, much bluer. This photosensitive shift is crucial for successfully painting leaves. These yellow and blue-green hues explain why most artists rarely use green pigments for foliage. Using a single green pigment can only create monotonous foliage that looks like artificial leaves. In my opinion, the key color for painting leaves is not green, but yellow. It's yellow that's used as the foundation for vegetation colors, not green. Remember what we saw about yellow. It's a color that can easily be changed. The slightest touch of blue or cyan mixed with yellow will inevitably give a green hue. And this is the type of mixtures that you need, as they can create the light colors and the shadows. So start from yellow and change its nature to give it different shades. Try to avoid white to mix foliage, unless it is to paint reflections on shiny leaves. Some pigments that may be useful include cadmium yellow light, yellow ochre, quinacridone rose, phthalo green, cerulean blue, and ultramarine blue or burnt umber. If your blends are too green, a little touch of magenta like quinacridone rose can be used to neutralize the color and get duller greens. Observe the different types of foliage and their nuances. The shades are very varied, ranging from yellow-orange to gray or blue-green. There are also plants with purple leaves. As I've already said, the green shades in this landscape are almost muted because the light of the sunset does not allow them to reveal their character. So I'm going to have to carefully avoid the green range. Indeed, the colors that are present are important, of course, but the colors that are absent are just as crucial. There is, of course, a natural tendency to focus on the colors that need to be painted, but it is also interesting to see the composition from the negative side. The colors that need to be excluded are an integral part of the composition. By their absence, they maintain the unity and harmony of the painting. So I know it's hard to do, but try to always see your colors in negative. Which are the colors that are not there, and why is it important not to let them enter the composition? This simple trick can really change the way you compose. Here, the luminosity of the twilight causes green objects to lose a lot of chroma. The foliage, grass, and greenish hue of the water will therefore have to be greatly reduced. I have already put aside my green tube, so I won't make an unexpected misstep. If I still needed, phthalo turquoise and yellow ochre can still mix a very strong green. However, it will really not be necessary here. Rather than using a clear bright green, I use what I call a dead green. Now, let me explain. It's a color that looks like green, but is not. In reality, it's a color that's closer to green than any other color in the painting, but technically not green. Here, I use my brown-gray to represent this dead green. I'll use this mixing line as a base because it's a low chroma color ideal for my composition. And if necessary, I add a touch of yellow ochre, cyan, or blue to revive the green hue. However, given the harmony of this project, the dead green that I use is more than enough. Again, it's not a green, it's more some kind of brown. And if there is one thing to remember, it's that what matters for the color to look green is not to be green, but to be greener than any other color in its context. As always, when it comes to color, it's all about relation. Kind of like chords in music. The same chords can be transposed into any scale, but the difference between the different notes that compose them is always the same. I continue with the reflection of the trees in the water. There is one thing I need to pay attention to. The darkest part of the tree in the reflection is actually lighter than the darkest part of the actual tree, and this is due to the light brown color of the water. Remember that the color of the reflected image is always a blend of the color of the object and the color of the water. So as you can see, the color of the shadow here in the real tree is darker than in its reflection. For now, I try to paint this part with a big soft brush to keep it very blurry. I don't hesitate to blend the outer edges with the rest of the water. It's always better to start with a big brush for this type of subject. Since it's only the beginning, the most important thing to do is to cover the entire surface. The small details to represent the branches and the leaves can wait for now, because what matters is to first put the big masses of color where they need to go, even if it means that it will look kind of ugly for the moment. There will be time to refine and take care of most of the details later. With a white brush, I blur the clouds to make the edges softer and create a smoother gradation between pink and yellow. That's all the time I had to spend on this painting today, so I'll let it dry and come back later. When I return on the second day, I start by checking the progress of my painting. It's always a good idea to give yourself some time to get a clearer picture. I take the time to look carefully at my painting in a black mirror. Note that I could also use the screen of my phone because it gives the same result. At first glance, my mirror reveals that I painted the sky far too light. I find it both too bright and too orange compared to my chromatic map. Not that I'm forced to follow it, but here a darker sky would suit my initial idea better. I would also like to let pink dominate more and remove some of the orange and yellow shades. I want to reduce the space occupied by the yellow to really only the lower right corner to make it just an accent. And as it's a cloudy sky, this can all be done in a very subtle way, and it's even gonna bring more complexity and more interesting colors to the sky. Regarding the diagonal composition, I'm satisfied with this choice. I'll try to keep the same model. I like the bright opening created by the turquoise tonic on the left. However, I would like to highlight this dramatic and almost unrealistic aspect of the sky more, as in Giorgione's famous painting, the Tempesta. These few light features in the threatening sky are as enigmatic as they are symbolic. They give incredible energy to a sky that would otherwise be monotonous. Although my colors are very different, this is the kind of pattern that I want to capture in my painting. I'll therefore be able to play on the values and refine the turquoise opening to create this unreal vision where you don't know if it's lighting or if it's the sky or if it's light. At the same time, I want to play on the tree on the left because it ended up being in the center of focus, and maybe to reinforce the drama, I plan to make it a dead tree at some point. I don't know, I'll see what I can do. Apart from that, I still have to refine the details and create elements in the distance. Maybe I'll add some mountains or hills on the horizon. Again, I'm not concerned with realism if it wasn't clear enough. So let's start by retouching the colors of the clouds. First, I create a darker coral red mixture that looks like Venetian red. I can simply modify it by adding a touch of quinacridone rose so that the color pulls more towards magenta. With very vaporous and soft brushstrokes, I melt the different nuances of this sky in a subtle way. Since the previous layer was dry, I can build the colors by superimposing them here. Some parts remain unchanged, some affect the final result by transparency, while others are completely covered by an opaque layer and no longer play any role. I keep the same approach as in the previous session. I paint with big brushes and try to blend the clouds into each other in a pleasant way. Right here, I don't exactly know how much I want to change the colors, how pink, how orange I want them to be. So what I do is that I mostly follow my intuition and I try directly on the canvas. For something as simple as a cloudy sky, this is very easy to do. I just paint with a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and I see what works. If I'm happy, I leave it. If not, then I just add more paint and try to blend everything. If things really go wrong, I can always remove the paint, scrape it with a palette knife. But for something as simple as a sky with clouds like this, it doesn't really matter. More paint means more volume, so I don't really need to remove anything to make corrections. I can sort of blend everything and start again over it. I mostly try to paint with spontaneity and let my imagination dictate what I should do. To create a more threatening atmosphere, I raise the contrast with more light openings and more dark, colorful clouds and create a strong impact. I don't forget to make modifications in the reflections. I try to keep a pleasant texture, but not too detailed. I want to make the sky behind the dead tree more dramatic, so I make it look like some sort of light breach in the sky, almost like a lightning bolt of light. As I planned earlier, I redraw the silhouette of the left tree, which is at the heart of the tonic color, and it's therefore a natural focus point. I didn't find the silhouette I wanted the first time, so I retouch it until I'm satisfied of it. I'm now preparing for the reflections in the water. Since I've changed the sky, I need to change the reflected image in the water as well. Like I did in the previous session, I mixed the color of the sky to the muddy colors of the water. See, I take a little bit of this brown and incorporate it to the blue here. Same thing for the pink tones. I end up with what I call a dirty version of the sky or a muddy version of the sky. See, muddy colors aren't always a bad thing. It depends on what you want to paint. Now I'll retouch the surface of the water with big brushes, and I'll try to use them in a horizontal motion to create the texture of the ripples at the surface of the water. I lighten the left side of the pond, always with soft horizontal lines to imitate the texture of the water. When I reach the details around the trees, I switch to a smaller flat brush, but I keep the same horizontal motion, always sideways to recreate this texture. Now I decide to add some hills in the distance, and to know which colors I have to choose, I must respect the principles of aerial perspective. Let's see what it is and how to use it. Atmospheric perspective, or aerial perspective, is a fundamental visual phenomenon for understanding the colors of a landscape. It is a gradual visual effect related to the amount of humidity in the air. The further away the object appears, the larger the volume of air through which the light rays pass, and the greater the effect. The aerial perspective is defined by three effects. In a landscape, as the distance between an object and the observer increases, the colors gradually change to blue and/or white, the contrast between the object and its context is reduced, and details and contours are less visible and less sharp. On colors, the atmospheric perspective has two effects that will be observed differently or simultaneously depending on the amount of humidity in the air. It makes colors white and/or blue. The more humid the air, the more the colors will change to white or gray, as is the case for fog, which is an extreme case of atmospheric perspective. This whitening is caused by water vapor and fine water droplets that are placed between the object and the observer and act as a natural veil. When the air is dry, it's easier to see that the colors turn blue. This is due to the same phenomenon that explains why the sky is blue, rarely scattering. The atmosphere acts as a light scatterer that scatters shorter wavelengths better than longer ones. Other rarer shades such as beige, cool gray, warm gray can be observed when the air is full of dust, smoke, or fine particles. The shift to blue can also be exaggerated by using a purple blue that's pulling strongly towards red. Finally, during sunset or sunrise, the aerial perspective applies in the same way, with the difference that the chromatic shift is towards yellow-orange instead of blue. The aerial perspective acts gradually but can be observed in a clear-cut way when the ridges of different landforms extend at a distance from each other. It's on a snow-covered landscape that the aerial perspective is most visible, with the white of the snow acting as natural canvas for the colors of the atmosphere. A fundamental principle of aerial perspective is observed in this image. It mainly affects the shadows. Indeed, the colors that receive direct sunlight are only slightly affected, especially if it's a very dry day. The difference in color between the sunlit snow on the mountain in the foreground and the snow in the background, several dozen kilometers away, is not even noticeable. On the other hand, the color of the trees and rocks in the shadows between these two mountains is very different. We can also observe that the shift towards blue has a particularly important effect on foliage, which is often present in landscapes. The trees closest to the observer have predominantly yellow-green hues, while those in the background have much bluer tones. Once you become aware of the aerial perspective, you will see its applications everywhere, even between objects that are not very far away. Here is a simple method to include the aerial perspective in your palette. Use your normal colors and, on the side, prepare an atmospheric mixture based on white and a blue pigment of your choice. The more distant the objects are, the more of this mixture you add. Zinc white can also be used in light layers in a similar way to create some sort of white velatura to mimic the effect of humidity. Don't overdo this because even zinc white, which is the most transparent of all white pigments, can quickly become too strong. Finally, one last important thing. Always combine atmospheric colors with aerial perspective in your landscape. If the sky has an orange-red tint, distant objects will not take on a blue tint, but an orange-red. Always follow the unity of the atmosphere and make aerial perspective match with the color of the sky. By following these simple but important principles, I create hills towards the horizon. For the sake of expressiveness, I strongly exaggerate the effect. The hills on the blue side undergo a shift towards blue, with ultramarine blue mainly, while the hills on the orange-pink side undergo a shift towards this color. The further away the object goes, the closer it is to the color of the sky until it blends into it. Thus, the technique is very simple. To paint the distant hill towards the orange side, I simply need to gradually add some of my orange-pink colors to the colors of the foliage. If I had to paint a blue, purple, or white object at this distance, it would be the same thing. Add more and more of the color of the sky as it moves away in the distance. The more we add, the more it will give the impression that the object is far away. I continue with details. I slightly modify the cyan breakthrough in the sky. I redraw the trees and reflections. I redefine the textures. All these little things that I might have missed so far. I decide to change the shape of the dead tree on the left again. I want to make the branches thicker and make it look more dramatic by really placing the light opening just behind it. I continue retouching the hills in the background and the trees in the distance. At this point, it's mostly details with no real impact on the whole, but still, details can have their importance. Personally, I like details, but I try to limit myself to the most important ones, like details that create a better contrast, or details that make the textures look better, or details that can highlight specific key points of the painting. Basically, if something is important, I'll generally treat details more favorably. But if it's something secondary in the composition that I don't really want to bring focus to, I'll naturally forget about the details. Details generally say a lot about an artist's approach. Your focus is where the details are, so of course, you need to decide where you want to focus your attention and the attention of the viewers. And just know that if everything is extremely detailed, it might actually end up looking strange because the eye can't find a place to rest and doesn't know what to focus on, and can be actually destabilizing. So you have to choose and decide what you want to detail based on what you want to bring focus on. Finally, it's time to move on to the plants and reeds in the foreground. I don't want to put some of these everywhere, so I'll alternate between rocks and plants to break the monotony of the shapes. Theoretically, if you want it to be perfectly realistic, which is not what I'm trying to do here, the plants in the foreground could be slightly greener than the plants in the distance, because you can see them from up close. However, in order to not break the harmony of my painting, I choose to paint them with the same color as the rest. The previous layer being dry, it's quite easy to draw grass and rocks clearly. I make some details to catch the eyes and just try to have fun. By keeping the foreground relatively dark and dull, I reinforce the focus on the color of the sky and on the reflection on the water. To be honest, this part in the foreground is really not important, so I don't want to let it take the focus away. However, by making it darker voluntarily, It sort of frames the composition and put the main subject in a box. It's not actually a part of the composition you're supposed to look at, but it works like a gateway to the composition. So like behind this part is what you want to look at. So that's the idea. The previous layer being dry, it's quite easy to draw grass and rocks clearly with very sharp details, but I try to avoid it as much as possible, even though it can be tempting because I don't want to bring any type of focus on this area. Now that my painting is almost finished, I put it upside down to refresh my perspective. This allows me to better visualize the reflections. We can see their color and shapes that still need to be corrected, including textures on the surface of the water. A change in perspective can really be helpful. Turning your painting upside down, looking into a mirror, tilting your head sideways, looking through a camera lens, looking through a tiny view hole, stepping back very far away. All these little viewing tricks can force your brain to reconsider things that it might have missed. When you spend so much time working on the same picture, again and again, hour after hour, your brain starts to become used to the picture and you end up missing things that need to be corrected. So you want to take your brain out of this comfort zone and force it to see the painting with a completely fresh perspective, as if it was the first time you were looking at it. Now it's time to take back my color study to see the evolution between the initial idea and the result. Obviously, the final result is much finer and more subtle, the original idea being only a rough version of the composition. It's normal for the first idea to be very rough, even particularly confusing. If your first draft seems to go in all directions, it's because your imagination feeds on composite material from all directions. Imagine thousands of puzzle pieces coming from thousands of different puzzles. Now make something new out of this mess. Thus, if the sketches seem rough to an outside eye, they are already very refined for the imagination. It's just extra material that imagination can build upon to move in the desired direction. The creative imagination gropes its way forward. It produces intermediate results and reassesses its progress constantly. It's not enough to have the idea. You need to see the color to know if it's the right one or not. It's a long and complex process, but I hope that all the theory and examples presented in this course will give you some ideas to allow your creativity to express itself fully.